Thank you, Peter. As a begin, I brought some of the copies of the book for people if you're interested in it. You can actually, I'll just, we can just, if you want to share one with your neighbor, if you want to keep one, that's fine. I didn't bring a bunch, but I brought some, so that might help you after the presentation and just seeing the practical outworking of what it is that the work entails. Most of what I'm going to speak about this morning is not specifically the major section of the book, but it's the development of that material and what the importance of it and the applicability of it is to the church. So I'm going to read a short section from one of the documents I submitted to Peter, and this is just to give you context for the book and for the development of this work. In the last 40 years, music as played in churches has made a tremendous transformation. Following the rise of popular music, beginning in the 60s and tracing the style of this music, church music and worship has moved from hymn-based style and repertoire to popular songs that changed as fast as the radio top 40 list. The rate of new music being produced for the church in worship has exploded as well. While the music industry itself has fallen into drastically difficult times, one of the remaining bright spots in the commercial world has been for Christian worship music. This is primarily because the viability of the worship music genre is not based in sales of CD products, but on licensing revenue paid for churches singing these songs. Worship music has proven to be a rare commercial income stream for music publishing during a time of almost every other music genre has vaporized amidst the demise of CD sales and the poor availability of digital formats, iTunes, as opposed to as being viable against the illegal copying and ripping of songs. The result has been that in the last 15 years, increasing focus on worship music has resulted in more songs, albums, and promotion of worship-related resources. During the same time, formats delivering music have changed from to digital files for both audio and printed music. What I want to say about this is that the context with which you found that worship music expanding and this particular intersection of church need and sort of business desire has happened in the last 15 years because of the things I've just stated, but also because of the change in the church, internally to it. And that's what I'd like to look at here. What the book will cover in the first 30 or 40 pages is this idea that there are four major changes that have happened internal to the church related to music in the church. And that is this. And first, style change. In the 60s, rock music moved from outside to inside the church. And this I pinpointed in the 60s because that's when it began. That's when a transition from popular music that was outside the church began to come inside of the church. And I'll explain how that happened very briefly. Every one of these topics could be a thesis project for someone, so it won't go at the depth that you would, in other cases. Methods, along with the style change in terms of the type of music that was played. The method of playing that music and the kind of instrumentation, kind of ensembles and arrangements and all that also changed. I mean, part of creating a different type of music is the kind of instrumentation you use to create that music. And this was fairly drastic in that it changed from pianos and choirs to guitars and rock bands. And tools, during the same time that the musical style transition and the instrumentation transition was happening, we had technology change happening as well. And so this is influencing the church as well. And finally, repertoire. This is more about where churches select their music from and how it was being made available to them. In the most cynical understanding of this, this would be how churches were being marketed to. And in the most benevolent interpretation, it's how musicians and church leaders were selecting their song liturgies. So I'm going to go down to each one of these points and just give you an outline of some of this information. Some of this information I've continued to research through interviews with people that were there in the 60s and the 70s during these changes. People like Chuck Frum, who started Maranatha Music, John Packleboo, who was part of Kingsway's earliest days in the 80s. Some people you know, Carl Tuttle and Randy Rigby, who were there in the earliest days of the Vineyard music. And so I've done interviews with these people, gathered some credible information about where the music styles came from, what they were listening to when they wrote the first songs, where the influence was coming from outside of the church and influences inside the church. So some of this isn't actually in the book; it's in the next revision of the book. But some of it is in there. So I just say that so if you see something here that wasn't in the book, if you end up reading the book, it's because it'll be in the next edition. So the first thing that we see is that the 50s and 60s rock music changed Western culture. This, this is fairly easy to see with in the 50s, Elvis, and then through the 60s, really with the Beatles and you get to the point where I was actually told by two different people that I interviewed that they felt that the culture movement, and specifically the Summer of Love, really was a big pivotal point at which not only culture began to change, but there began to be a deep pressure in the church to begin to, if we were going to reach the people that we, at least in some areas of the country, that was going to be that was going to begin to have quite an impact. So what we found from that is the Jesus People movement in Southern California began this incorporation of rock music into the church. And without getting that whole story out to you, basically what happened was in Southern California, and actually starting in Northern California, and depending where you place all of this, people began to be saved that were part of the hippie movement, or part of the rock culture at the time. And they came in most pointedly through the Calvary Church at Chuck Smith. And one interview that I had talked about, they had this tent on the property of where the church would later be built. They didn't have a church, it was just a small building for the original church. And they had rock bands come, and they'd been saved. And so now they were singing about Jesus rather than the other things they used to sing about. And they would form new bands, and Love Song was one of those early bands, and other groups. Out of that, they had concerts Saturday night with thousands of young people showing up that were just being saved, and now they had music they could listen to that was connected to the new faith that they found. Well, at the end of these concerts, these basically, pop concerts they began to play songs that they had just been making up in their personal prayer times, and this was the very first that I could find where these people that were there at the time would say, this is probably what we think of as praise music that has been developed. This was where Karen Lafferty was part of one of those groups, and she wrote Seek Ye First in that context. But almost all of these groups, Vineyard, Maranatha, Kingsway, and other writers in that era would all point to Scripture and Song collection by Dale and David Garrett from New Zealand as probably the source for most of their initial inspirations for later writings. So if you're sort of a musicologist, you're looking at it from that perspective, they really were the first ones that kind of took and said, well, let's just read the scriptures, the Psalms, and let's sing them in as a contemporary at the time style as we could. And so there was a sort of folk music attribution to the Psalms, and that's no matter who you would talk to in those earliest days, they would point back to those folks who are still writing music today and still around participating in that. And then I talked about Love Song as one of the early bands and early praise songs coming from there. Probably more than anything else, the creation of Maranatha Music, which was something that Chuck Fromm from the Calvary Chapel churches did, and then he asked his son-in-law, Chuck Smith, asked his son-in-law, Chuck Fromm, to run this company, Calvary Maranatha Music. That became a new type of sacred music in the church, and it's not like this hasn't happened over the years in different ways. We could look further back to other styles of music that have come into the church over the hundreds of years, and even as far back as Gregory, who introduced the chants, and you can move forward and see this has happened over time, and it continues to happen. This is just that we're alive in this era, and we feel like it's probably somehow, well, it's more special to us because we're living it. Mm-hmm. We get to see this, right? So now, aside from the style change, so we're seeing this style change of music that was hymn-based to now music that is more popular-based. You had this other change that happened to accommodate that style, and that was that you moved to primarily, especially in the Jesus People movement, and the music that came out of there, guitar-based instrumentation. So it was much easier to play a folk song on a guitar than on a piano. Well, this creates, and I talk very briefly about this in the book, but this creates something very unique if you think about it. It's very difficult to carry a piano on your back. And to go to a home group and bring a piano with you is difficult, and so the idea that now you have an instrument that you can pick up, you can go anywhere, you can play it on the beach, you can play it on the street, you can play it anywhere. All of a sudden, your liturgy, and I'm using these terms interchangeably because the context with which this is being done becomes liturgy. It starts off as music and they're just entertainment, but it becomes for those people and for us later liturgy as part of the incorporation of our worship. Now, so the acoustic guitar gains acceptability as a tool for worship, and it adds to it without anybody thinking. Nobody was probably thinking, let's make worship mobile by using guitars, but that it had that effect. You had the increase of that with this simple melodic songwriting that came along with the pop music of the day, and the inclusion of rock guitar bands, instrumentation. Now, again, nobody was probably thinking, let's replace the choir. Nobody was thinking, let's replace the hymnal. Okay? But in order to move one style of music from one style of music into other, all of these things happened. People began to use rock bands, not because they were trying to replace choirs, but because that was the music that could be played to do this style. They began to use, in the music world, as musicians, this was the first time non-classically trained musicians in a long time in the church began to be the purveyors of the musical liturgy. And they didn't know how to read sheet music, most of them. They grew up in rock bands, garage bands, trying to emulate the heroes of their day, the Beatles, the Elvises, and so forth. And they knew how to play chords. That's what they knew how to play. And so you begin not only with a style change, but with a methodology change that ushers in this whole new possibility. On top of that change, the third change that we had happening in the last 30, 40 years were a movement based in technology. This has happened everywhere, right? This isn't new to just to the church. It's going on everywhere. But it affected the church specifically as it relates to things like lyrics. Well, 40 years ago, if we were in a church service, I would say, now please pull out your hymnals and turn to page 132. And we would begin with 1, 2, and 4 verses of whatever hymn. But in the 70s, you probably remember the days where people were putting acetate transparency films up there, and then by the 80s, if you were still using that, you were still okay. But by the 90s, if you hadn't got some sort of TV projector or a slide projector, you were starting to miss the technology curve. And then, you know, I remember going and getting slides made for our church of our popular songs. It cost us $15 a song to get the little slide made, and then we had our preloaded 75 songs that we could do in our repertoire that were in the camera, and we knew the numbers. And well, by the late 90s, computer projection software began to be developed. The first computer projection software that was developed in about 98 that was popularized. And so you moved, technology made this move where all of the style and methodology changes were happening. Technology was making the move for lyrical content from a hymnal onto a computer-generated screen, and the different steps in between. At the same time, musician resources, so how people actually involved in the music of the day that were performing the music in churches, moved from the hymnal as their actual source, as their source for reading the piano music, getting the basic movement of music, to later songbook collections that began to be developed. I don't know if you remember the Praise series, the Green Book series from Maranatha, the Hosanna songbooks from Integrity, the Vineyard Songs of the Vineyard collections through the late 80s, early 90s, and through. So you began to see people, publishers, you know, creating collections that were not hymnal based. They were just, what are the best songs that we can put together? And this is a change that is fairly important for other reasons, actually mostly theological, because before, you think of hymnals, why they were developed was for two reasons, and this is a whole other topic, but they were developed and curated by denominations. This means that the theology of them was strictly adherent to whichever selection committee was creating that hymnal. Well, for the first time, probably in 150 to 200 years, as hymnals had kind of embedded themselves in church liturgy, you had music companies, people from possibly non-religious entities, creating songbooks, not because of the content of the lyrics, but because of the popularity of the songs. And so the collections, now you had groups like Vineyard who were theologizing their, creating their theology through music. In some ways, this is how we learned much of what we understand. Other groups weren't doing that. They were just putting a collection of songs together that they thought was the most popular, and that moved. So musician resources technologically moved from the hymnal to songbook collections, later to CD-ROM collections that had PDFs, and now to websites. And almost invariably, this technology has moved with it. And you might find yourself at different places along that road, and we're going to look at a diagram that'll help with that. The last thing that technology was affecting, and I'm not even going to go into the detail of this, but any of you that are involved in media or music in the local church knows that we went from a acoustic world to a powered world in the 60s. With rock music was the first popularization inside the church, where we used electricity to create music. Before that, all of our grand cathedrals created the amplification we needed for audio and for voices and for music, and now it was plugged-in amplification, right? And it was sound that was created through technology. And then, of course, in the last 20 years or so, digital incorporation, digital technologies in not only in music creation, but in things like soundboards and in just a vast array of technology that's been affecting us. So the fourth major change that's happened inside and affecting media and music inside the church is what I call cynically promotional, benevolently song selection. And this is the progression here, that we went from the hymnal, which was which was almost exclusively the sole source of song repertoire for churches for many years, to word of mouth in the the late 60s, early 70s. The way a chorus caught on was Peter found a great chorus, and he shared it with his friend, and this church heard it from these people, and word of mouth spread these things. So you would hear a song. I remember even in the mid 80s hearing awesome God that way. Someone had played it, and it wasn't on any record, it wasn't on any CD or anything, but it was just spreading through the church, word of mouth. After that became commercially interesting to people, music clubs began to be formed, and some of them, again, were simply to facilitate the movement of music through certain groups, like Vineyard. You know, you had Touching the Father's Heart, you had Vineyard, Songs of the Vineyard, Integrity had Hosanna Music Club, Maranatha had their praise series. What began to happen, people began to get sort of a regular diet of this type of music, and so instead of the hymnal forming your repertoire or just word of mouth, you began to pick up the latest edition of some music club, and what songs am I going to use now? And this began another type of thinking of how we gain access to songs in the church, having little or nothing to do with selection by pastoral guidance or this kinds of thing. So, and then this rate of change began to increase across the last 20 years to where events became very popular. Music events, we would call them worship conferences in some contexts, and others. Vineyard probably were the second group to do this largely. Maranatha had conferences that were meant for training musicians. Actually, some of the earliest ones, I'm trying to remember the name of them, but they were praise conferences, and they were using this to not promote their music, but actually to teach churches how to play the new contemporary style music. And then of course that void was there for the music, the need for the music. So events were very popular, from Vineyard's conferences to Worship Together conferences in the late 90s and early 2000s. And now those events continue more as artist events. And so you'll have a Chris Tomlin, but these are much more akin to contemporary like concerts than strictly like church service music that we would have heard in the first 20 years of this. Brand names became important. Again, this is a promotional vehicle, but a song selection is being deeply influenced now by large churches like Hillsong Church or Lakewood Church or Gateway Church in Texas now. And so what you have is you begin to have influence coming from centers of music creation that are church-based often, but sometimes they're just brand names. I mean, if Chris Tomlin writes a song, tens of thousands of people are going to listen to that song, regardless of whether it's a good song or not. Doesn't mean that it's not a good song. I'm just saying it becomes important in a market sort of in a marketed society that's how music is being propagated. Websites become important because they're easy access and everyone has the ability to get there. This is why sites like worshiptogether.com, worshipmusic.com became popular for the last 13 years. It was just easy access, and people would go to a place, they began to see consistent, regular, easy, trustworthy information. And then finally Christian radio, and now Christian radio has become probably one of the more prominent uses of songs. As the worship music shifted from just in church, now it's one of the main contents of Christian radio. So this is in the book, this diagram, and it may be easier for you to see it there. But I want to just cover basically what I've talked about is, and this is kind of the key, I think, point to the change that's happened that I'm highlighting there. And that is, you'll note that we started with traditional, what I call traditional church resources, to praise and worship resources, to worship resources. The etymology of the term is described a little bit in the book and how that changed, to modern resources. Well, you'll notice that song promotion, congregational lyric guides, musician resources, and hymnal resources, choral resources, that these four things were all centrally located in the hymnal. In 1960, I could say that I got my repertoire, my musician resources, my congregational lyric guide, and the the choral music, all from the same source. Well, technology, methodology changes, music style changes, and promotional changes all force the hymnal from its preeminence as the purveyor of music liturgy in the church from one item to about 20 different items in the span of 40 years. And that now, what was easy to say, here's our liturgy, the hymnal, is now, you can't say that unless your church uses a hymnal primarily, and that's where you're at. So because of this, if you look at this span and the number of resources that developed, this is a timeline. Well, as a person who's a music leader myself, and then as one who helps train other music leaders, for me to go into a church and help them and help them with their program of music, I have to be able to understand where they're coming from, and they might be here, and I'll be able to help them there, or they might be here, and I can help them there, or they might be here or here. And as you might have churches that have chosen to keep the hymnal as their lyric source, but their musicians are using something else. They might not use the hymnal as their lyric source. They might use a digital projection, but they might still be doing songs from the 70s or 60s stylistically in their content. So what I've done here is just laid out for you the progression that was made, and it helps churches as they're evaluating resources. What's useful to them? Why should they care about a digital display software? Why should they care? Well, they shouldn't if they use hymnals. It doesn't matter to them. So the reason that I created this and this investigation into why this all happened was so that when someone now goes to evaluate a resource for their local church, they don't have to. They can take and look at who they really are and where they really are, and ignore things that don't apply to them. And so by dissecting this a little bit, people can look at it and go, oh, okay, we're here. We're using the music clubs from our denomination that help us. That's great. We don't need to worry about these other websites. And so all this does is it just helps people see context for where it came from, why it's there, and what's available to them for the future. And the book, then following on that, is the first section. All I've described to you here is the first section of the book. The latter two sections of the book are simply reviews of about, literally 101 reviews of different products and services that are available to churches, and I simply review them on the basis of critique. And I say, this is useful in this scenario, this is useful in this other scenario. Here are the best resources for this particular application. And it just gives people an edited Consumer Reports type of information on worship resources, so they don't have to spend hours and money, trying out all these things for themselves. I've done that for them already. So that's primarily what I wanted to present, and I hope that some of the information allows you to see kind of where we've been a little bit, but also to see the task that music leaders have in front of them, is they have to deal with this change and try to help their church, and now they're being bombarded with these a lot of marketing messages, and this book is an attempt to try to help them parse out those messages and you get something that's useful for them and their local church.
I don't know about you, but my head is full of questions. So Kim's available. This is the time.
Daniel talks a lot about the idea of ancient future, and as you were doing your research, do you feel like there is a trend now to continue forward, so to speak, or do you think that they're just at the point where there's more reflection back on how maybe the methods and the genres and things that we used to have? Do you think that there's any going back in that sense?
Going back, yeah. I think part of there is a backlash. I think part of it is an overload in general, like what we felt like. There's just too much. There's too much music. There's too much technology. There's too much complexity, And I do think that there's a looking back right now, and you're seeing a return to more piano-based music in worship. You're seeing in some places a removal of the technology because of just the difficulty of change that's happened. Not removal completely, but white, like instead of fancy motion backgrounds with oceans and seas and I mean, it's there. You're just seeing lyrics with a black background, white text, because people are trying to create a worship space, and they're realizing that some of the technology ill-used becomes a distraction in worship, not an enhancement. So that, I think you're right. I think there is a looking back, and it's in everything from music selection to instrumentation style, and a recollection of some of the hymnody as well. Like, this is why Tomlin and other people, I use him because he's popular and everybody knows he is, are rewriting a lot of the hymns. They're taking hymns and they're adding choruses to them. And you'll see that almost every album that comes out now has one sort of hymn in it with a new chorus. And this is the same. This is for the same reason. People are looking back, going, "Well, we all this changed in the last 40 years. We need to go back and grab something that we know has helped us over the years and can anchor us a bit." And so that's happening in the libraries. That's a good observation. Yeah. Walt, I think you were the big hand.
All right. Well, one of the fascinating things you said this morning, one of many, is the shift away from the denominations being able to say what's in the hymnal and to a commercial center in many cases. And I mean, I can see some pros and cons, because the denominational is probably too status quo, right? But at the same time, sure, can see a lot of danger in that. Have you seen some really obvious gains and losses, theologically speaking, or for the life of the church?
Yeah, it's interesting. Because one of my main jobs in the last 15 years has been reviewing albums and that's definitely happened. What I think has happened, not only in music but in speaking, in the popular speakers of the day, in Christian world. And so you see people, and again, I'm going to use Tom Lay again. I don't know why I'm worried about that, but he's an example of that. I don't know. I looked through his songs. I can't find one reference to the Holy Spirit in 100 and some songs. Now, he writes about the transcendence of God primarily. If you look at his lyrics, you look at this, it's about the glory and goodness of God, almost nothing about the immanence of God. Now, these are the two major themes of Scripture, in my opinion, when it comes to the depiction of the Trinity, is the immanence and the transcendence. And they're married, constantly churning up and down. But we have one writer, probably the most popular writer, who writes on one side of that side. Now, that's all, like all of us. We will tend toward the thing that we learn. Now, he has a theology that's coming out of his music. It's coming out in his music. And so, Vineyard would have been all very heavily on the immanent side and less on the transcendent side for many years. So I think that it publishers, writers, it's a danger that we're not guided. If we're not guided pastorally, that can definitely happen. And those are two examples that I've seen. But you do see that in strange sense, and I use this very loosely, that the marketplace in some ways balances that out. You have that happening in one world, and when it wasn't available and there was a dearth of it, vineyard music came along and eminence was the big thing. And well, that kind of, and then people were like, "Oh, are we singing love songs to Jesus all the time? He's my boyfriend." And now it's, I'm exaggerating to make the point. And you see this balance happen because voices said, "I'm going to do something different." But it's less of a guided thing as it is sort of a conversation happening on the open. So whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure, but it has happened. Absolutely, yeah. Yes?
Just wondering, two-part question. One, could you outline some possible stepping stones that someone like myself in a very real context could take a church from still being completely hymnal based to moving it towards the modern world? And the second part of the question, would tablet technology possibly play in the continuing integration of what's going on?
Yeah. Let me start with the first. It's interesting that the hymnal represents not only a type, a way to archive our liturgy, but it represents one that's about 150 years old. In other words, 100 years old. I keep thinking I'm in the 80s, so I'm missing about 30 years of information. But what the reason I mention that, Rob, is people believe that the hymnal and the contents of it are sacred, and yet, in some ways, it's a psychological thing. Well, this music is 150 years old. That must mean it's more credible. It's more somehow holy, and I'm creating a theological profile for you, or a psychological profile for you in a minute for that. But the fact is, when it was written, when it was compiled, that music wasn't 150 years old. Okay, and it was still used then. And so I think the danger is that the hymnal can represent to us something that says old, but in fact, we could create modern hymnals now. And this is really what we've done over here. This is just a modern derivation of a hymnal. It's a digital hymnal. The problem is it's not compiled, and it's not thought out in terms of the way they used to think hymnals out. And so when you're talking about a church now that thinks of the hymnal as their source of songs, I would say that moving it into a progression of finding new, you have to ask yourself the question, why would you do that? Are you going to do it because you feel the content of the material that you want to move to is more beneficial to your local church and is a broader expression of the Trinity? Then I would say if those are the kinds of reasons that you would like to move, then begin making that move. But you can make that move probably easier by getting a hymnal that contains some of the new material and allowing the other expressions that could come out of it. So if you're using a hymnal from the 1905, or like that's actually where the content comes from. It might be reprinted since then. Try something like the Celebration Hymnal, which has been written in the last 20 years. It's a very broadly used hymnal. Includes contemporary choruses in it. Has a lot of older songs in it. The idea of a hymnal for people will be much more acceptable. And then on top of that, the Celebration Hymnal has video display resources for it and so forth. And so you can use something like that to move forward and not frighten the people that feel the hymnal has some sort of iconic value to them. That would be kind of a suggestion on moving forward. Just ask yourself the question, why do you want to move forward into something else? And then getting you there is easier to do in that kind of situation. Now, when you talk about tablets as moving forward, yeah, I mean it's there are applications now where people are reading sheet music on iPads and moving forward, even display projections happening from iPads. So that's definitely going to be more and more used in the future for sure. Greg, sorry, you have to.
Bob's been trying.
Good, Bob, now.
Okay.
Thanks so much for a great presentation. You talked just a bit about pastoral oversight of worship music, contemporary worship music. And it got me thinking, are you able to distinguish, in terms of pastoral oversight of the work that's being done, music that's being written and performed, are you able to distinguish between, is there any kind of a continuum or any trends or patterns that you can pick out from, like Vineyard through various other Protestant expressions to Roman Catholic expressions, maybe to Eastern Orthodox, in terms of the role of the pastor or the sort of the theologically trained leader of the community?
Well, Dan Wilt told me that if I got a question I couldn't answer, he said to say that was beyond the scope of my research. And I feel like I could pull that part out right now, especially when you got to Eastern Orthodox and others. I have some ideas about that, but I think most of them are anecdotal, and I didn't do research that widely and to be able to answer that question well. So, sorry. Bob.
Yeah, I wanted to say to him how much I appreciate your work and putting this into historical context for us. And you know, it almost kind of makes me think of the old joke about if you want to move the piano from this side of the church to that side, you have to move it 1 inch a year or something.
Quarter of an inch a Sunday.
Quarter of an inch a Sunday,
Yeah.
something like that, yeah. But to look back and take this in review is really good. So I'm really interested, but actually Rob's questions kind of got to my interest. And I'm thinking about smaller churches that have, you know, they've experienced a certain kind of life and quality of the old hymns, and somebody who could play the piano well. And but the church is aging, and they want to attract younger people, and so they started experimenting with choruses and then moving on. And the quality isn't there because they don't have those people yet. And so I've seen in some cases using the technology, like you know, like maybe some people up front singing and some projection on the screen and trying to
audio
sort of
tracks.
yeah. And can you look into the future? I mean, how would you help and counsel what I'm guessing is thousands of churches across Canada and the United States?
Yeah, and what you know, it's difficult. I think it's going to be really difficult for those churches because they're going to continue to get the marketed message that they need to be on par with the popular thing they're seeing. In other words, here's a product we're selling that has the rock band in an iPad. Now sing along with it. And that'll give you the sound that you're hearing from Hillsongs, or the sound that you're hearing from this popular group or that popular group, or this Vineyard album, whatever. This is a difficulty, right? Because we're trying to give people resources to do something, and yet, in some ways, we're telling them by doing that to be current, you need to do this kind of thing. I think that this backlash things to me is big. Like, what do we see with popular music in the early 90s? We saw a return of acoustic music, right? There were the rock bands in the 70s and the 80s, and then I think probably Eric Clapton was probably one of the first the Unplugged album that he did, and it was this powerful, poignant message inside of it. We're going to take away all the music, electronics, and power, and we're going to just play the guitar again. And I think that's happening now more with the piano, and you see that. And so I think for churches, my hope is to communicate to them, who are you really right now? Who do you have the skill set to employ in your local church? Let's start right there. And if I was counseling a church that just had a piano player, I'd say, let's get some great piano music for you. Something that you can play just with you. And something that might be contemporary courses, but they're arranged for that kind of situation. And then if you want a drum track, or you can get that. You can get the single tracks of any instrument you'd like, and you can get it in a piece of software that you can just turn on which tracks you'd like. Because and I have a drummer today. Turn that part off and keep the bass going. I have a piano player. Turn that part off. So there's technology to allow you to keep what you can use and substitute. Or, I mean, my recommendation to any of those churches that I'd be counseling or consulting with would be, do what you can do now, but enjoy the form of music that you like in terms of the songs, and just arrange it for the kinds of instruments you're available. So as you get people, because
they see that as authentic, and now they're coming to check your church out, and they happen to be musicians. There are lots of ways to bring those people in and to incorporate them and to begin using. Now, as a musician, I might be playing the piano, but when I get my bass player or my drummer, I don't have to wait until I have a full band to use them. I can use the other parts digitally. And so we can begin to incorporate musicians earlier than we did before, where I wouldn't put a drummer up there if I didn't have a bass player. Well, now you can, because you can have your bass player in a box. Which a lot of people would like to do.
Which needs you to turn them down.
Yes.
Who do you think struggles most with the changing technology? Would it be the congregation or the worship band as such, or the worship? I mean, the leader of the church.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the congregation by far. Yeah. I think they want, what we think of as a community and a local church is they want a place to go that has some stability and some constancy. And I think that's difficult for people. I think change is always difficult. Musicians, being one, I would say, are interested in change, at least as long as they can be a part of it. The difficulty for most people is not that change is there, it's that whether they can enjoy it or not. If change happens without them, that's isolating. If change happens with them, that's empowering. And I think whether it's a musician or a congregant, this is the issue with change. It's all these things I've mentioned. If you can incorporate people into that change, they will be empowered by it. If you don't incorporate them, they will feel isolated by it.
Kim, can I step up from behind the camera and hoping that I could get a question in?
Yes.
And this may be beyond the scope of your research too. Can you back up a couple of slides? There's one of these transitions that happened that yeah.
Okay.
The transition that's happened in my time that I've always been a little mysterious to this move away from, like, this move from the music off the music club thing, this sort of to the sort of brand and these sort of church. Do you have any idea why that happened, or a sense of why that happened?
Well, I think part of that was that the music clubs were there initially because someone needed to create a container for this fresh, new thing that was happening in terms of the different churches that were expressing it. And that became this vehicle, whether it was the Hosanna Club, the Vineyard Club, whatever. Well, those, if we think about it just as congregational people, those were happening, those events happened as a move of God. For the most part, music was being inspired, and that happened for a season. Well, when that season may or may not have come to an ebb, these clubs still existed. And so you have, and they're claiming, well, here's our next edition of music that is more or less inspired now. And so that begins to wane in popularity because there's something about it that people, when you sing a song that comes from your heart, it's the life of your congregation, it's really what's happening, and God is stirring, the world will join in with that song. And this is why those clubs became popular, is because the world was joining in. Well, when you begin to write songs to be on that club,
Nice.
then it doesn't connect with me. It's not my experience. It's maybe a reiteration of something that they heard earlier, and so that's why we began to see events, because now I can go to an event and I'm experiencing along with someone else what the impact of this inspirational music is doing in my life. So I think that's partly what was happening.
That's certainly what, yeah, that's good. That's what it felt like at the time. It seemed like they became, like produced because they could be or they had to be, overproduced.
Yeah.
They sort of became very milquetoasty kind of thing, didn't seem to have, and then, it had to be replaced by something that, again, had that spark in life again.
And I think this is also why you see today, for example, the popularity of I'll just name two groups, and again, it's because brands become instantly popular now in our culture.
Yeah.
Is Jesus Culture,
yeah.
and the IHOP folks. I can't remember the name of their music group, but Forerunner Music is because this is an experience-based music that comes from what they feel is a movement of God amidst them. And so this is always going to be attractive to the church because real stuff is happening to them, and they want to connect with that, and music is a great way to do that.
It's more of a comment, really, than it is a question. Maybe you can expand on it. But do you think that that sort of like staleness that happened in the music clubs will happen again, or has the web really made that impossible? Because if you think about it, in music club days, we were getting,
Right.
we were getting booklets shipped in
Right.
packages and tapes or CDs or whatever. And now there's no sense of like, oh, I bought into that. It's
Right.
like, oh, I'm tired of this
Mhm.
particular brand. I'm going to go
Right.
find another brand online.
Right. I think that as long as God is moving and inspiring us to write new about Him, there's going to be new available out there. I think the difficulty is now the web allows anyone to make noise. And so there is so much noise.
Overwhelming.
Hearing perhaps something that would connect with me is much more difficult. Or at least as difficult as getting a club that has only 12 selections on it. And I can go through them quickly. Now I have to go to 100 websites and drill down to 10,000 songs. Please. It's more difficult. I'd much rather go back to the beginning here and have you come up to me and tell me, this is a great song that I just heard. And so the web has really done is created a re-emergence of the need for real community, even amidst music. So, Walt.
You probably saw the video that went viral not too long ago about the old guy in the nursing home. Did you see that one? He was a guy, he had what seemed like dementia, some kind, depressed, wasn't able to respond to questions. I'm not seeing Bell's lit up, so maybe you didn't see it. But a lot of people saw this video. It was a guy wasn't able to respond to questions, didn't seem to care about anything, and then someone gave him an iPod with. He was a real music lover in his life. Someone gave him an iPod of the kind of music that lit him up when he was a young man.
Okay.
And you could just see the guy completely overwhelmed when he started listening. I mean, his whole being came back to life again. It's as if his brain still worked after all. It just needed the on switch, And after first it seemed like it was just during the music, but then the music stopped, and you could ask him questions, and he'd answer just these full, articulate sentences. He was all still there, And it just made me think, we need continuity. I mean, who's going to play the music that lights me up in the nursing home? But is that going to have the same? We cycle through it so fast.
Yeah.
That what's going to get lost in terms of the ability to carry that kind of presence with us.
Yeah. No, that's why I think that's why liturgy has such value. When I say liturgy, I mean a continuity to the music that enables us to go forward and retain our past as well in the same cycle. Yeah, no, that's
You
great.
should look that up if you haven't seen it.
I will, yeah.
This is just about the end of our time, and I actually think we could probably keep asking some questions. But was there anybody else that had a burning question before mine? I didn't mean that to be funny. I didn't have a question, but I'm willing to wait if somebody else would like to have one more. Carol, you don't have a question?
I'm just kidding.
I don't know why it was so early.
Okay, here's my question. I loved the things you've made us think about today, and I love the way that you had the spectrum between cynical and benevolent. The cynical view is this, the benevolent view is that. And I've heard in this, and I think the answer to Rick's question actually touches what I'm wondering about. But I guess I just wanted to ask you, about your own perspective. I know that you've been a businessman in this world, a consultant in this world, a trainer, a practitioner. You created some of the software that churches used. You had the largest or one of the largest worship businesses in web businesses yourself, and you work for large music companies, have done. Now, but when I talk to you, I don't sense that you're a cynical person about worship. And I guess I would like just a little bit of personal reflection about where you find yourself in that spectrum. I know, I've been told before about a particular songwriter, a particular song that was popular, drawing in £1 million a year for a certain number of years. It's pretty hard to take that pure move of God and only care for the pristine thing when you've got musicians out there that would like to have just even a part of £1 million a year.
Yeah.
So where do you come down in the spectrum now when you've lived so much through the whole thing of it?
Well, I come down 2 legs. My first leg is that I meet God through music in so many ways. It's a sacred space. And I probably do this more because I want to see the church find that sacred space again, for whatever that means for them. And not to give it up just because there is the possibility of cynicism, which is easy to do. And that's in my heart. And if it happened with Be Thou My Vision, a 1,500-year-old song, or if it happened with something written this year, I would be delighted. And it's just, the depth of it for me is that it changed my life personally. And it changes, my sons, anyone who has children has this connection with what works and what doesn't work. And my sons recently my one middle son especially has discovered some early vineyard music that really moved me when I was a young man. Still does. And he's like, Dad, this is so great. He's listening to it and he's, Dad, can you play some, let's go have a worship time. You can play some of these songs. And he thinks it's just great because he's discovering it for the first time. And he has some new music he loves. Well, what it tells me is that some of the things we do have value over generations. And it continues to have value. So I'm determined to find the things that have value over generations, whether they happen to be my style or not, and try to unlock that for other people in terms of making them aware of it and letting them feel great about just ignoring stuff that isn't helpful. And so, not becoming cynical is difficult. But then I have another foot I have to come down, and that's that I got to pay my bills. And I think, many people that are involved now in the commercial enterprise of worship. First of all, that in the last 5 years, probably about 80% of the people that made money in music no longer make money in music. The numbers in terms of dollars that's left in the music industry, and then you go down to the Christian music, and then you go down to the worship, are just a fraction of what people were making between 2000 and 2005. 2005 was the end of the sort of the time when music was making money. Now today, less. I think the number would be something like 25% of the dollar value of income that's made in music that was made even 6 years ago. So there are a lot of people that would have made money. And now there are a very few select group of people that are still making a lot of money, because there's one part of the worship music income stream that still exists, and that's through licensing. And that means that if you write a song and it becomes popular, that you can still make a good amount of money. But we're talking about less than the 50 people
in the world that would make enough money writing music to be in the category that, you know, I mean, very few people will be doing that. And so I do find that difficult. I mean, but I know people that have made billions of dollars in defense contracting, or in software development, or in oil drilling, or in textiles. And I'm not saying whether or not any one of those having that money is to me is not the issue. It's, are you giving it away? Are you helping the poor? And certainly the people that are writing worship music have at least the backdrop with which they can help the poor, with which they can take that money and do something good with it. Whether they do or not is their conscience, I suppose. But that's, you know, I try to. It breaks my heart when I begin to engage myself in worship. So it keeps me, I think, from going, you know, too far into this. And I've been cynical. I've had times of cynicism. When you get fired from a music company, it's difficult not to, you know, become cynical. And when you know, go through different times of doing that. But I just believe in the fact that God has and continues to use music as a sacred space for people to meet Him.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.